Have you ever wondered why some people literally can't wait to jump out of airplanes on the weekend, while others are perfectly happy staying in for a quiet, structured game of chess? Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to look really closely at this exact comparison. By pitting high and low sensation seekers against each other, we basically get a perfect magnifying glass into the human brain to figure out what exactly drives these wildly diverging preferences. We are going to unpack the fascinating science behind why our brains biologically crave, or actively avoid, thrills. We'll be looking at the comprehensive research that maps out this whole intriguing landscape. Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today. First, we'll be defining sensation seeking. Second, high versus low seekers. Third, risky habits and hobbies. Fourth, the biology of thrills. And finally, safe outlets for seekers. Section 1, defining sensation seeking. So let's establish a firm baseline. At its core, sensation seeking is defined by a deep need for varied, novel, complex, and intense sensations, and, crucially, the willingness to take physical, social, legal, and financial risks just to get that experience. But here's a really important distinction to keep in mind. Risk is usually just accepted as a byproduct to get the sensation. High sensation seekers don't normally seek out danger for its own sake, they just kind of accept it as the toll they have to pay to get the arousal they crave. Scientists actually measure this using a standard self-report questionnaire that cleanly breaks this broad trait down into 4 specific, measurable dimensions. You've got thrill and adventure seeking, which relates to your classic extreme sports. Experience seeking, which is more about novel mental or sensory experiences. Disinhibition, dealing with outgoing, sometimes impulsive social behavior. And finally, boredom susceptibility, which is exactly what it sounds like, a complete intolerance for repetitive or unchanging environments. Section 2, high versus low seekers. And this brilliantly illustrates how these two concepts compare in everyday life. When we look at the two extremes, we see just how deeply ingrained these traits are, extending right down to the careers people choose. High sensation seekers are naturally drawn to unstructured, highly chaotic jobs. The research points to folks like crisis counselors working in hectic emergency rooms, forensic identification specialists dealing with constantly changing evidence, or firefighters. They literally thrive on that external stimulation. Conversely, low sensation seekers strongly prefer structured, well-defined tasks that offer order, routine, and a sense of predictability. This stark difference also dictates how both groups perceive identical situations out in the real world. I mean, what one person naturally calls a threat, the other calls a thrill. High sensation seekers generally appraise environments as much less threatening, and they anticipate a really quick recovery if things happen to go wrong. Low sensation seekers look at the exact same risky or stressful situation and appraise it as highly threatening, naturally expecting negative consequences. To put a number on just how powerful this perception is, researchers looked at how people gauge crime risk or minor violations risk. They found that perceived peer behavior, combined with a person's individual sensation-seeking level, accounts for a massive 50% of the variance in how they appraise that risk. Think about that. Half of your perception of danger in these scenarios comes down to who you hang out with and your own internal baseline for sensation-seeking. Section 3, risky habits and hobbies. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is what happens when this need for stimulation goes unchecked. When we stack these two profiles up against each other, there is a clear correlation between the magnitude of risk behaviors and a person's psychological profile. Look at the contrast. High sensation seekers report high frequency and intensity in alcohol and drug use, whereas low seekers report very low frequency. The exact same thing applies to extreme sports. High seekers participate eagerly, while low seekers avoid them entirely. Even driving habits contrast sharply. High seekers are linked to reckless driving and speeding, whereas low seekers remain super cautious and rule-abiding. And this search for novelty isn't just about physical danger. It extends right into personal relationships and dating styles as well. High seekers often display what's called ludic dating styles, essentially navigating romantic relationships where the partner is deliberately kept guessing about the status of things. They also show far more permissive attitudes towards sexual encounters. Low seekers, representing the complete other side of the coin, strongly prefer stable, cautious social and romantic interactions. Section 4, the biology of thrills. So, where does this behavioral divide biologically originate in the brain? Well, because of obvious constraints on biological experimentation with humans, scientists often look at animal models to understand these brain behavior relationships. Here, researchers separated rats into high responders and low responders, based purely on how they reacted to novel environments. The high responder rats eagerly explored complex mazes, had heightened dopamine activity, and even chose to self-administer more amphetamines. The low responder rats? They actively avoided the novel environments and showed much lower dopaminergic activity. The biological craving for novelty is literally hardwired into their dopamine pathways. So the crucial point is how this translates to human stress responses. Cortisol is our primary stress hormone, right? You might naturally think that high thrill seekers have crazy high stress hormones, but it's actually the exact opposite. High sensation seekers exhibit a blunted or incredibly low cortisol response to acute psychological stressors. They possess an incredibly high stress resistance. Low sensation seekers, however, experience high cortisol release and high emotional arousal when faced with the exact same stressors. Their bodies are sounding a massive alarm, while the high seeker's body is staying remarkably calm. We also see this biological marker in enzymes, specifically monoamine oxidase, or MAO. When comparing professional bullfighters against an age-matched control group, the bullfighters, who pretty much represent the ultimate extreme thrill seekers, literally possess significantly lower levels of MAO activity compared to the average person. Lower MAO is biologically cemented to higher sensation-seeking and risk-taking traits. Section 5. Safe outlets for seekers. Let's move to and see how this builds into actionable everyday life. The most important takeaway here is that danger is not a strict requirement for stimulation. High seekers can adapt their biology to find healthy, intense arousal in entirely safe avenues. This includes high-impact but well-planned sports like scuba diving or rock climbing. But it also includes everyday stuff, listening to arousing hard rock music, traveling to unfamiliar places, taking in highly unusual or complex art, pursuing stimulating careers, or even volunteering for novel scientific experiments. For young adults particularly, the text lays out a really clear roadmap for reducing negative health consequences. Step 1 is simply identifying those impulsive, risky habits. Step 2 is substituting them with equally stimulating, non-risky alternatives, like the ones we just discussed. But step 3 is the real secret ingredient, incorporating peer socialization. Sensation seekers naturally cluster together. If you want a safe alternative to actually stick, it needs to be grounded in a peer-based community program where they can experience that high stimulation together. We've seen how starkly high and low sensation seekers compare, right down to their fundamental dopamine and cortisol levels. It's like two completely different operating systems. And that leaves us with a really provocative thought. If our need for thrills is deeply biologically wired, how can our communities better design safe, high-arousal outlets to accommodate these high-sensation personalities? It's definitely something to think about the next time you see someone chasing a thrill. Thank you so much for learning with us today on This Explainer, and we will see you next time.